St. Louis. I'm really glad that we actually got some Baltimore focus here. But St. Louis is a place that has experienced hyper fragmentation and hyper municipal fragmentation, 88 municipalities in the county. Um, and so I'm curious if you each could speak to some of the peculiarities of the jurisdictional context um, of your respective cases and just how that shows up. How's it showed up in not just the book, but in the stories that didn't make it into the book, in your own lived experience of these places? Are there any weird, quirky, interesting, or difficult ways that jurisdiction is a major part of the stories that you tell? Sure.
Hi, thank you for that question. I think one thing that makes DC interesting, apart from the lack of democratic rights that we have, and the lack of representation, and well, we have a representative, they just don't vote. But we get the vote for them. We just voted. I voted before I came here. Anyway, um, one thing that makes DC different from a lot of cities, I think, is that when DC began its most recent wave of gentrification, which is the most intensive wave of gentrification, the only neighborhoods that were gentrifiable were majority Black. So DC doesn't have this experience of like first gentrifying white neighborhoods because the last low income white neighborhood in DC was Anacostia, and all of the white people left in the 1960s and maybe into the 1970s. But by 2000, there were zero low income white neighborhoods in DC. And it is just interesting. I grew up in DC. To grow up in a city where there's no low-income white neighborhood at all. And that kind of shapes the context of the city and the race and class dynamics. But there are very many very high-income Black neighborhoods. So what that allows you to kind of see the racial dynamics. So in DC, there's a very high-income, majority Black neighborhood called Shepherd Park. And in the 1980s and 1990s, that neighborhood where at the time, the average income was nearly $100,000. It was a very high income neighborhood. There were no sit down restaurants. So like it's just interesting. You can really see how race and class interact both. So in terms of gentrification happened, gentrification happened very quickly in majority Black neighborhoods, which is different from other cities. And high-income Black neighborhoods have been perceived to have gentrified because of the accompanying private investment that came along with white in-migration, but they were already upper middle class that just didn't have any private investment.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll be quick. So just jurisdictional difference in regional context. New York City's big. That was a brilliant statement. The metro area is bigger. That's significant here because I found it fascinating. The people who I studied almost saw moving to this small municipality as almost like the clouds parting in their lives. Being in New York City was overwhelming for them and overly complicated, in the sense that they couldn't feel like they could root themselves there, or that they feel like they could make a difference even in their own communities and neighborhoods, let alone at the city level. So there might have been something about just the stark contrast between the context that they were in when they were in the metropolis versus being in this much smaller, much more intimate, much more comprehensible and navigable place that ignited this civic and political desire that they had to participate and get involved in their communities very directly. I wonder. Also, something to quickly mention that I really didn't touch on very much at all in the talk, but I do discuss it a bit in the book, is the extent to which there are many smaller municipalities in the New York City metro area that have become new destinations for international migrants and become these non-traditional gateways, primarily of people in the New York City area from Latin American communities, who come to the Hudson Valley as a point of first arrival, not folks who have moved there from having arrived, say, in New York City or Newark or Jersey City or something like that, but people for whom this is their first sort of community in the United States. And that plays a very big role in Newburgh and other municipalities there that I didn't really touch on very much, and very much complicates the kind of black-white segregation divide that we typically talk about. And scholars have focused on this in the South and in the West, the far American rural West, but to the extent to which it's happening in the more and more densely populated Northeast, I think is a factor here, at least in my work, and is underexplored.
So I've studied New York City, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And then I decided to do this study of St. Louis and Baltimore. Those places weren't gaining population, they were losing population. So, like, does gentrification even matter? Aren't those places of high concentrated poverty that will never gentrify? And that's what some people told me. They said, why are you going? Aren't you a gentrification scholar? There's no gentrification in Baltimore. There's someone writing a book called The Ungentrified City right now about Baltimore. So I've interviewed scholars that have been studying the St. Louis region for 20, 30 years. I asked them, is gentrification happening here? And they said, no. I said, really? That's interesting. Is it happening on the same extent and magnitude that it happened here, that happened in New York City, that happened in DC or Chicago? No. But is it happening, and is it important to spatial and racial inequality? Absolutely. So I think places like where Richard studied, there weren't a lot of gentrification scholars going up to Newburgh, or like going to small areas on the periphery of the metropolitan region. I hope his work encourages young scholars to go do that. I hope that my work encourages scholars to go to places that traditionally haven't gentrified, but gentrification may be so critical and so important to different outcomes on health, education, wealth disparities, persistent segregation, because I think that gentrification is critical to understanding the St. Louis region and Baltimore's metropolitan region. But I've had to fight other scholars to get that even on the table, and I think that's absolutely crazy. And these scholars have said to me, Derek, you're writing that gentrification, there's too much gentrification. That's a problem related to the uprise. And they've said back to me, you know what the real problem is? There isn't enough gentrification. If we had more gentrification in North St. Louis, things would look better. If we had more gentrification in East and West Baltimore, we might be able to solve our problems. And I looked at them and said, you're out of your mind.
For some definitions of the problem, I guess, in that case. But so one thing that struck me, engaging with all of these talks and these books, a lot of gentrification literature, I think, historically has dealt with causes and consequences of gentrification, and what is pushing it, and then what does gentrification do to the communities where it's unfolding. That's not everything. That's a little bit of a gloss, but I think causes and consequences is sort of a good framework. And I think all of these books engage with gentrification as much as context rather than cause or consequence. And what I mean by that is that the core of gentrification is, or the core of the book is almost elsewhere. I guess in Richard's case, it's still gentrification somewhere else, but even then, the gentrification in New York is sort of a core contextual piece for understanding the moves that people are making. And I guess another way of putting it is that we've broadened the consequences beyond local neighborhood ones to sort of, what is it doing to wealth inequality, if anything? What is it doing to, the sort of structure did that just go, okay, the structures of carcerality and public safety and how that's driving violence and uprisings and whatnot. And so I'm just curious, so far there's been a comment. I guess the question is this something that's changed about gentrification? Or is this something that's changed about the ways that we're studying it now? Is the literature kind of catching up to the broader things gentrification is doing? Or is it that gentrification itself is doing new things that it wasn't doing 40, 50 years ago?
I'll go first. So I love the framing of the question and of, is there something new about the drivers? I don't like the word causes because we're not doing experimental design. Even if we did it, I still don't like causes, right? So like maybe drivers, correlates, something related to something new about the drivers of gentrification. And if so, I think you're asking, is there something new about the consequences? And I would say for my work, it's not new. State-led, I'm knocking down a public housing, state-led gentrification. We've been talking about that for a long time. But I think what is new is connecting that to a different outcome. And the outcome is the unrest. I don't think many people have done that. And I don't want to, and the other thing is the consequence of the gentrification, the state-led violence. I think the new thing I'm trying to add is chronic displacement trauma. And maybe that's not new because Mindy Fully-Loeb wrote a book called Root Shock, which really laid that out well. And I discussed with Mindy for years as I was writing this book. And I basically said this idea, though, that it's cyclical and it's multi-generational. And she has a concept not just of root shock, of serial displacement, but I hope this idea of this chronic displacement trauma, and then it gets repressed and it comes out at certain moments when police violence, that's the new twist. So again, state-led violence, gentrification, but a different outcome, chronic displacement trauma. So I think that's what I hope my book adds to the gentrification literature.
Yeah, and I like the framing as well, the idea of cause or consequence or context. And I would say that the idea that it's driver and consequence, cause and effect is what is new. If you talk about it cyclically and multi-generationally, like Derek just mentioned, then we're seeing this, at least in like what I'm seeing in this more regional context, this kind of cascading effect that gentrification coupled with housing unaffordability kind of creates this regional pattern through which people will extend outward and outward and outward from the urban core and kind of reproduce conditions that originated in the large urban context in the hinterlands, smaller municipalities and the kind of outer ring suburbs, and even pushing into rural areas, as well as this idea that when they arrive in these places, they bring this awareness of what gentrification is and of what being a gentrifier is. Which is what motivates a lot of the behaviors that I observed where I studied, because they're already coming with this idea in mind of what gentrification is. And often it still has that stigma attached to it of not wanting to be the person who is behind that kind of process. So what can you do about it? But then it becomes, what do they do with that awareness and that consciousness now that everybody knows what it is in this new place where they're in a stronger position to shape what their actions are going to look like there. That's that's the new, I guess, but it's also like a bit of a reproduction.
I started this project because I wanted to understand the long-term consequences of a very intensive war on drugs on Washington, D.C. And it was only through conversations with people who had been directly impacted by the war on drugs that the topic of gentrification came up. So this didn't start out as a gentrification project. This started out as kind of what have we done to our cities? Like I said, in 1997, half of young Black men were caught up in the carceral web. So what does that mean for the city today? So gentrification came up in conversations with people who were also grappling with the consequences of the war on drugs. So I think it's a cohort effect. Like it's if you're studying a city that experienced the significant consequences of the war on drugs, and gentrification started after that. Like, so it may not always be the case. There's other drivers, but in a city that experienced the consequences of the war on drugs, then you have to look at that in order to understand the drivers of gentrification.
Thank you. I'm curious about how these works are received by the folks in these places, and maybe like distinct from like the member checking that we often do as we're engaged in research and like showing people, like, is this true? Is this an accurate representation? But now that the ink is dry, the book is out there in the world, it has a life of its own, and maybe lands in the place that it's about, how people are connecting with that, engaging with it, how does it engage folks' logics of what's happening there. Yeah.
I'll start. So I have the great fortune of living in Washington, D.C. when this book came out. And so I presented this book at probably 6 or 7 different public libraries in Washington, D.C., at local bookstores. Anyway, all over the city, many, many different times, community organizations, local groups. So I've had the great privilege of actually most of the times that I've presented the book or had discussion sections about the book has been with community members in DC. And I think it was very gratifying to hear Jessica's remarks today. But when people in the community keep saying to you, yes, that is exactly what happens. That's when you know you're doing good history, good sociology. So for me, it has been very gratifying. And also, just by the way, my very first review, I don't think was a good read on the book. So it was nice to have had very positive community reception and to be very clear that I mostly wanted this book to be well received by the community. That was my primary goal. And like also in this point in my career, I can afford to do that. So I didn't like my first review, but it didn't hurt my feelings because they were my audience.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I mentioned I live near Newburgh, but not in it. And I have had the opportunity to discuss it a lot with people in the community, most actually, but I've gotten stronger reactions from other gentrifying small cities in the Hudson Valley in terms of wanting me to come and speak to them. I mentioned that there are other places where you see a stronger anti-gentrification resistance in those places. So that's where I've had probably the biggest reaction. But I think I've had 4 reactions in Newburgh. One from the communities of color that have been very interested in the book and are very gratified, I guess, by some of the findings, a lot of what they've observed and experienced. I kind of pointed out, so they kind of felt, gratified by that. Some of the anti-gentrification people in Newburgh, the people who at least were critical of it, the newcomers, that is, agree with it, I guess, or support the argument. So that was nice. And some react to it with a much more individualistic response, like, well, maybe this is happening here, but I'm being a good neighbor. I'm being a supportive person. I try to shop at a, minority-owned business once a month, whatever. They put the sort of, moral code on themselves for that, right? And then there are the folks who are just dismissive of it because they don't agree. They think that what they're doing is the right thing, that it should be this market-based transformation, expansion of a creative economy, service economy, and we just are at loggerheads and it's not going to work out. So if I could share a quick story of this. So when I was doing the member checking with one of my participants, and it's somebody who's an artist who's very much works to try to expand the amount of public art in Newburgh, and I've sent him sections of the book, especially ones that he appeared in, and he doubled down on no, this is it, art and culture are what's gonna save Newburgh. And he reminded me, he goes, do you remember the gates? And I don't know if you remember this. Like 20 years ago, New York City had this massive public arts exhibition called The Gate. You're nodding enthusiastically. You know what I'm talking about. So there were these massive saffron flags that they just put up everywhere. I'm not an art critic, so I don't know anything about this. But it was like Christophe and Jean-Claude, right? That was it. And anyway, they put these things up. And he said, do you know how much that revenue that generated an economic activity for New York City for people who went to hotels and then they went to restaurants and they saw the gates and then they bought a t-shirt and then I don't know how much. And he told me, and I don't remember how much it was. It was an impressive number. Well, I don't know, no context for it, but it was an impressive sounding number. And he said, see, that could be here. That could be in Newburgh. We can do something like that. And I'm like, okay, I hear you. But if you read my book, my response is, well, if it was so great in New York City, then why are you here? Why'd you leave New York City then? Like, because you got kicked out. You can't afford to live there anymore because you're not an elite artist. You're a good one, but you're not so good that you can afford to stay here. And that's why Newburgh is an outpost of New York City's arts economy, because New York City's got too much art. Like, it's so good at art that it doesn't need all these artists in one place. And I get no response. That's a data-supported argument. And he's like, well, I guess so, but we're going to do it different this time. Okay. And then we're back in square one. So there's just, at some point, there's just going to be this contention that is going to be irresolvable unless there's, I don't know. Anyway, that's all.
So I presented this book at Red Emma's. I don't know if everybody knows Red Emma's in Baltimore, but it's the activist bookstore. And then when I did my presentation, I didn't do one in Ferguson. I did it at Left Bank Books, which is in St. Louis, also the activist bookstore. It was interesting, and Jessica, it relates to one of the questions you asked or posed. And it was sort of, well, what are the policy recommendations? Do we do reparative justice? Like, after all of this, like Tanya talked about the level of inequality, Richard talked about how people think they're trying to do anti-displacement or racial reparations within gentrification, and they're not doing it. They're just, and so what do we do? And mine talks about real harmful trauma related to gentrification. So how do we address this? And so I guess when I made my presentation in Baltimore, most of the heads were nodding by the activists about the content. But then when I got to my policy recommendations, and I said this, 1-for-1 replacement for public housing units, bring it back. We repealed that in 1994. 1998 officially. So I said, don't voucher out this stuff. You want to knock down a public housing unit? You better build another public housing unit within the municipality. We will reduce displacement. The other recommendation is tax increment financing. It's a tool. Like eminent domain is a tool. The Dudley Street Initiative here in Boston, an activist group, Black-led, I'm pretty sure Black or Brown, used eminent domain to build affordable housing. Let's use tax increment financing. Not to gentrify, to build affordable housing. We could do that politically. And then the third recommendation was racial reparations around housing. And this is related to Tanya's book, that we have huge disparities in Black and white home ownership rates. And also when African Americans own homes, they don't get the equity that whites do. Well, this is related to the cycle of racial and spatial repression, racialized zoning, redlining, disinvestment, right? Well, we can clearly document who has been discriminated against in the housing market. And we could actually, instead of giving them a subprime loan, we could get them a below market rate loan, going market rate 7. They should get a 4% loan. The second I said that, the Baltimore activists jumped up and said, you neoliberal professor, you're working within the capitalist system. We want to rip the whole system down. And I said, good luck. In the United States, rip it down. Defund the police. Where'd that go? Like, stop. I mean, and Jessica, I know you're pretty radical, and you